The bustling alien marketplace hummed with a symphony of languages, scents, and the clatter of traders advertising their wares. Stalls lined the cobblestone paths, draped with colorful fabrics and exotic artifacts, each one promising mystery and value to any interstellar traveler willing to part with their credits. Darren had seen a lot in his years working intergalactic security, but nothing quite like this. He wasn't here for sightseeing, just a routine supply run before heading back to the orbital station. But something about this place, with its chaotic energy and peculiar charm, made him linger. A small, unassuming stall caught his eye. Unlike the others, it lacked flashing signs or aggressive sales tactics. Instead, a delicate collection of trinkets gleamed under the ambient light. At the center of the display sat a single bracelet, crafted from interwoven metal strands that shimmered as if alive. Something about it called to him. "Ah, a fine choice," the vendor said. An elderly alien with translucent skin and too many fingers. His voice rasped like dry leaves. "You have a good eye, human. That piece is special." Darren smirked. "That what you tell all the tourists?" The vendor only chuckled, watching with knowing amusement as Darren picked up the bracelet. It was surprisingly light, cool against his skin. On impulse, he slid it onto his wrist. A sudden hush fell over the immediate area. Conversations died, heads turned, and several bystanders exchanged startled glances. Darren frowned, his instincts flaring to attention. A woman pushed through the forming crowd. Or at least, she looked like a woman, except for the faint glow to her skin and the way her deep green eyes seemed to catch the light unnaturally. Her long, dark hair spilled over her shoulders, unbound and wild, complementing the silver and emerald attire that fit her like ceremonial armor. "You?" she began, then stopped as if struggling to find words. Her gaze locked onto his wrist. Panic flickered across her features. Darren raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong. You wore the bracelet." Her voice was smooth but edged with something bordering on distress. He glanced down at the piece of jewelry. "Yeah, I was just trying it on. Nice craftsmanship." No, no, no," she muttered, stepping closer. "You don't understand. That bracelet, it's a sacred bonding relic. It signifies an eternal partnership." Darren blinked. "Wait, what?" The vendor, now grinning in a way Darren did not appreciate, gave a small bow. "Congratulations, human. You are now lifebound." The woman exhaled sharply and pressed her fingertips to her temples. "Of all the reckless, do you have any idea what you've done?" Darren felt a weight settle in his stomach. "Look, this has to be a misunderstanding. I didn't sign up for any lifelong anything." "It doesn't matter what you intended," she shot back. "Among my people, intent means nothing once the bond is sealed. And you put it on. In public." A murmur swept through the gathered onlookers. Some seemed amused, others wary. A few looked downright scandalized. Darren clenched his jaw. "Fine, let's fix this. I'll take it off, give it back, and we'll call it a day." "You can't just take it off. The bonding is ceremonial. It's recognized at a genetic level." "What does that even mean?" "It means," she said, voice tight, "that until the bond is formally dissolved, if that's even possible, you are, by all legal and cultural standards, my partner." Darren rubbed his face with his free hand. "Great, just great." A sharp voice cut through the tension. "This is unacceptable." A tall figure stepped forward, his heavy footfalls echoing against the stone ground. He wore ornate armor that gleamed under the market's lights, his violet eyes narrowing in disapproval. "Zayara," he said, addressing the woman, "this human has defiled our traditions. He cannot be your chosen." Zayara stiffened. "I didn't choose him, Varen. It was an accident." Varen's gaze shifted to Darren, full of distaste. "Then correct it." "I don't know if that's even possible," she admitted, frustration clear in her voice. Darren held up his hands. "All right, time out. Let's all take a deep breath. There has to be a way to undo this. I'm not in the habit of getting engaged to strangers." "Bonded," Zayara corrected absently, before shaking her head. "And that's the problem. There might not be a way out." Varen's expression darkened. Then he must prove himself worthy. Darren groaned. Oh, come on. But before he could argue, Zayara's eyes met his, filled with a complicated mix of irritation, desperation, and something else he couldn't quite place. Like it or not, human, she murmured. Your life just got a lot more complicated. Darren had been in his fair share of diplomatic incidents, but nothing quite like this. He followed Zayara through the winding streets of the alien city, her stride stiff with frustration. The marketplace's vibrant hum faded behind them as they entered a quieter district, where the architecture turned from sprawling stalls and open courtyards to towering spires that gleamed in the twilight. The buildings were impossibly smooth, their surfaces shifting in color like liquid metal under the artificial suns overhead. The place screamed wealth and tradition, two things Darren usually avoided. "This is your home?" he asked, breaking the silence. Zayara exhaled through her nose. "My family estate. It's where we'll be. Staying until this is resolved." Something in the way she said "resolved" told him she didn't expect it to be quick or painless. He glanced at the bracelet on his wrist. The damn thing still felt cool, almost pulsing against his skin, like it had become a part of him. Maybe it had. "So, what exactly are we dealing with here?" he pressed. "You said intent doesn't matter, but surely your people have had mistaken bondings before." Zayara's shoulders tensed. "Rarely. Our traditions are sacred, and our bonding artifacts are kept under strict control. No one just stumbles into a commitment like this. Guess I'm just lucky." She shot him a glare, then stopped in front of a massive set of doors carved with intricate patterns. With a flick of her hand, a panel beside them lit up, scanning her palm before unlocking with a soft chime. The doors swung open, revealing a grand hall that smelled faintly of something floral but unfamiliar. Inside, the walls shimmered with embedded crystal veins, casting soft ambient light throughout the space. A few figures lingered in the distance, their robes flowing as they turned to watch the newcomers. Darren could feel their gazes like pinpricks on his skin. "Zayara!" A voice echoed from the far end of the hall, smooth but firm. An older alien woman approached, her bearing regal. Her gaze flickered to Darren, assessing him with the kind of scrutiny that made his muscles instinctively tense. "Mother," Zayara said stiffly. Darren exhaled. Great. Meeting the parents. Zayara's mother studied him a moment longer before speaking. "So, this is the human." Darren cleared his throat. Yeah, Darren. "You are aware of the gravity of what you've done?" "Still getting a crash course, honestly." Zayara's mother glanced at her daughter. "And yet, here we are." Zayara's jaw tightened. "We need to find a way to undo the bond." Her mother's expression remained unreadable. "And if there isn't one?" Silence stretched between them. Darren shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the older woman sighed. "For now, he stays. We will consult the elders. Until then, the bond must be honored in full." Zayara visibly stiffened. "Mother, I will not allow our traditions to be disrespected, accidental or not." Darren held up his hands. "Look, I don't want to step on any cultural landmines here, but maybe we should define what honoring the bond in full actually means." Zayara's mother's gaze pinned him in place. "It means you will represent this family with dignity. You will attend functions, follow protocol, and, should it come to it, defend your place at Zayara's side." Darren frowned. "Defend? Against what?" A voice interrupted before she could answer. "Against those who believe a human is unworthy." Darren turned to see Varen standing near the entrance, arms folded, a smirk curling at the corner of his lips. He was dressed more formally now, his ceremonial armor polished to a near-blinding shine. Zayara sighed. "Not now, Varen." "Oh, but now is precisely the time," Varen said smoothly, stepping forward. "The elders may debate, but the people, our people, are watching. They won't simply accept this oversight without challenge." Darren crossed his arms. "Let me guess. You want to be the one to challenge it." Varen smiled. "Of course. Tradition dictates that if a bond is contested, The outsider must prove their worth or surrender their claim. Darren glanced at Zayara. And by surrender, we mean? She hesitated. It would mean forfeiting all rights to the bond. You would be stripped of any claim to protection under our laws. Some would see it as an insult. Others? She trailed off, but the implication was clear. If Darren backed out, it wouldn't just be an awkward breakup. It could be seen as an act of dishonor, maybe even an offense worthy of punishment. Darren sighed. Why does this always happen to me? Varen stepped closer, lowering his voice. You're an anomaly human, a mistake, and mistakes don't belong in our society. Darren clenched his jaw. He dealt with plenty of self-important military officers and bureaucrats who thought humans didn't belong in the wider galaxy. But this was different. This was personal. He looked at Zayara. What happens if I accept? She hesitated. You'd have to fight. A formal trial, not just physical, but a test of will, strategy, and endurance. If you win, they'll have no choice but to acknowledge the bond as legitimate. Darren took a breath, rolling his shoulders. Then I guess I'm fighting. Zayara blinked. You don't have to. I know, he interrupted, then looked back at Varen. But I'm not backing down. Varen's smirk widened. Good. Then we begin at first light. The moment Varen left, the tension in the room snapped like a pulled wire. Zayara turned on Darren, frustration flickering in her glowing eyes. Are you insane? Probably, he admitted. But unless you've got a better way out of this, I don't see many options. Zayara exhaled sharply and rubbed her temples. You don't understand what you've agreed to. Darren folded his arms. Then explain it to me. She studied him for a moment before shaking her head. You're impossible. Yeah, I get that a lot. She turned away, pacing. You'll need to be prepared. The trials aren't just about fighting. They'll test everything, your instincts, your resilience. You'll be put through physical challenges, strategic puzzles, maybe even psychological endurance tests. Darren whistled. Sounds like boot camp all over again. Zayara finally stopped pacing and looked at him. You're really going to do this? He met her gaze. I don't like being pushed around, and I definitely don't like the idea of people deciding my worth before they even know me. Something in her expression softened, just for a second. Then she sighed. Fine, but if you're going to survive this, you're going to need my help. Darren grinned. Well, if I'm stuck with a lifelong partner, might as well get some coaching out of it. Zayara rolled her eyes but didn't argue. The trials awaited. Darren stood in the center of the grand ceremonial arena, its towering walls inscribed with ancient symbols that shimmered under the pale blue sky. The gathered crowd encircled him like a living wave, their collective murmurs an ever-present hum. The air carried the scent of metal and dust, anticipation thick enough to taste. Across from him, Varen stretched his arms, his polished armor catching the sunlight as he smiled with the confidence of a man who had already won. He had the bearing of a seasoned warrior, one who had fought and triumphed many times before. Darren, on the other hand, was just a human, a wild card, an anomaly, an inconvenience that needed to be erased. Zayara stood just outside the combat ring, arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was unreadable, but Darren had spent enough time with her over the last day to know she was worried. She wouldn't admit it, but she had drilled him through every possible scenario, pushing him past exhaustion the night before. Despite the limited time, he had learned a few things. Her people valued precision, patience, and control. They fought not with brute force, but with grace, strategy, and unshakable discipline. Darren, however, had spent most of his life getting out of impossible situations by being unpredictable. He could tell Varen wasn't expecting much from him, and that was his advantage. The officiant, a robed figure standing at the edge of the ring, raised a crystalline staff. The crowd fell silent. This is a challenge of worth, the officiant intoned, his voice carrying across the arena. Should the human Darren prove himself, the bond shall stand uncontested. Should he fall, his claim shall be dissolved, and his presence among us will be forfeit. Darren exhaled slowly. No pressure, The officiant struck the staff against the ground. A deep chime resonated through the air. The duel had begun. Varen moved first, fast and fluid. His weapon, a curved blade that pulsed with an inner glow, sliced through the air toward Darren's ribs. Darren barely dodged, twisting out of the way at the last second. He wasn't armed, but that was part of the test. His people had insisted that if he wanted to be accepted, he had to prove his worth without the aid of his own technology. Varen struck again, this time forcing Darren backward toward the edge of the ring. Darren ducked low, sweeping a kick at Varen's legs, but the alien warrior barely seemed fazed, countering with an elbow that clipped Darren's shoulder. The impact sent a shock through his arm, but he shook it off. The crowd murmured. This wasn't a fair fight and everyone knew it. But that didn't mean Darren was out of it yet. He adjusted his stance, remembering what Zayara had told him. Her people valued directness, which meant Varen expected him to fight head-on. So Darren did the opposite. He feinted left, baiting an attack, then twisted right, using Varen's own momentum against him. The warrior staggered slightly, eyes narrowing in irritation. Darren smirked. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Varen responded with a sharp jab to Darren's ribs. Pain flared, but Darren gritted his teeth. He'd had worse. The fight continued, a brutal exchange of speed and instinct. Darren wasn't stronger, but he was scrappier. Every time Varen adjusted, Darren threw something unpredictable into the mix. A sudden drop, a feigned stumble that turned into a counterattack. The crowd began to murmur louder. What had started as an expected rout was turning into something else. Then, in a blur of movement, Varen caught Darren by the wrist and twisted. Pain lanced through Darren's arm, forcing him to his knees. Varen leaned in, voice low. "You don't belong here." Darren grinned through the pain. "Funny. I was about to say the same to you." With his free hand, he drove his elbow hard into Varen's side. The warrior grunted, grip loosening just enough for Darren to twist free. He rolled backward, breathing heavily. Varen's expression darkened. He wasn't just fighting to win anymore. He was fighting to crush. Darren braced himself. Varen lunged, blade flashing toward Darren's throat. And then everything stopped. A sharp chime rang through the air, the officiant's staff striking the ground once more. The match had ended. For a moment, neither Darren nor Varen moved. Then Varen stepped back, confusion flickering in his violet eyes. The officiant turned to the crowd. "The challenge has been met." Darren blinked. "Wait, what?" Zayara stepped forward, her gaze fixed on the officiant. "He passed." The officiant nodded. "The trial is not about victory, but about proving resolve. The human has done so. The bond stands." The crowd erupted in mixed reactions, some in approval, others in disbelief. Varen's jaw tightened. "This is a mistake." The officiant's gaze was firm. "It is law." Varen looked as if he wanted to argue, but instead, he turned sharply and strode from the arena. Darren exhaled and turned to Zayara. "So, that's it." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's it." The reality of it hit him then. The bond wasn't just some mistake to be undone. It was real, and it wasn't going anywhere. He glanced at the bracelet on his wrist. It still pulsed faintly, like it had its own heartbeat. Zayara sighed. "You did well, but this is just the beginning." Darren looked at her, at the crowd, at the city beyond. He had no idea what came next, but he wasn't running. Not this time. The sun dipped below the towering spires of the city, casting elongated shadows across the ceremonial grounds. The echoes of the trial still lingered in Darren's mind. The heat of combat, the weight of the crowd's judgment, and the realization that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. The bond was real. It was permanent, and there was no turning back. He followed Zayara through the dimly lit corridors of her family's estate, his muscles aching from the fight. She hadn't spoken much since they left the arena, but he could feel the tension radiating off her. "All right," Darren finally said, breaking the silence. "What's the next step? Do I get a crash course in being an honorary alien? Or are we skipping straight to the part where people try to kill me again?" Zayara stopped abruptly, turning to face him. You don't understand what's happening, do you? He frowned. I thought I was keeping up pretty well, all things considered. She exhaled sharply. Winning the trial didn't end this. It only ensured you wouldn't be cast out immediately. But the scrutiny, the challenges, the expectations, they don't stop here. If anything, they get worse. Darren rubbed the back of his neck. So what? More people lining up to take a shot at me? It's not just about you, she said, her voice quieter now. This affects my family, our standing, everything. Darren studied her. Beneath the sharp edges of her frustration, he saw something deeper: worry, maybe even fear. You didn't ask for this either, he said. She looked away. No. They stood in silence for a moment. The faint hum of the city beyond the estate's walls buzzed in the background, a constant reminder of the world watching them. Darren sighed. Look, I get it. This is a mess. But if we're stuck with it, we might as well figure out how to survive it together. Zayara glanced at him then, something unreadable in her expression. She nodded once. Come with me. She led him deeper into the estate, through a series of corridors that gradually became less grand, more personal. They stopped at a door, and she pressed her palm against the panel. It slid open with a soft chime. Inside, the room was lined with holographic projections of star maps, ancient texts hovering in the air. Along the walls, weapons of various designs were carefully displayed, each one unique, each one carrying a history Darren could only guess at. This is my personal chamber, she said. It's where I train. And if you're going to survive here, you need to start training too. Darren raised an eyebrow. I thought I already passed the test. She folded her arms. That was just the beginning. You may have won the trial, but that doesn't mean you're ready for what comes next. He glanced at the weapons. So what are we starting with? Swords? Spears? Some kind of weird telepathic combat? Zayara actually smirked at that. Hand to hand first. If you can't handle yourself without a weapon, you won't last long even with one. Darren rolled his shoulders. All right, let's see what you've got. The training started immediately. Zayara didn't hold back. Within minutes, Darren was flat on his back, staring at the ceiling while she stood over him with an unimpressed expression. You rely too much on instinct, she said, offering a hand to pull him up. That works against untrained opponents. But not here. Darren groaned as he got to his feet. I'd call it adaptability. She raised an eyebrow. Adapt to this. She moved in again, and Darren barely managed to block her strike before she hooked his leg and sent him tumbling sideways. He hit the mat with a grunt. Okay, he muttered. Lesson learned. She smirked, extending a hand again. This time he hesitated before taking it. As the training continued, Darren gradually found his footing. Zayara was relentless, but he was stubborn. Each fall, each mistake, he adjusted. By the end of the session, he was breathing hard, bruised, but still standing. Zayara nodded in approval. Better. Darren wiped sweat from his forehead. Glad to hear it. She stepped back, studying him for a moment. You're different from what I expected. He chuckled. You say that like it's a bad thing. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to one of the star maps, gazing at it with a thoughtful expression. This bond, she said slowly. It may be more complicated than either of us realized. Darren frowned. What do you mean? She hesitated, then shook her head. We'll find out soon enough. Something in her tone sent a chill down his spine. He had a feeling that whatever came next, surviving a simple duel was the least of his worries.